I'm Aaron Meyer, and you're listening to the 1909 Podcast. The 2022 Big Ten basketball tournament is upon us, as is the launch of 1909's Big Ten Tournament Collection. So it's the perfect time for the Chucker to connect with journalist and author Ed Sherman, the Big Ten historian.
The history of college basketball is fairly recent. Even the NCAA basketball tournament didn't start hitting the height of its popularity until the late 70s.
Together, they dig into the conference's hoops history, including his Mount Rushmore.
Bobby Knight was such a pivotal character and figure in the Big Ten, and I think he's one of those guys that when you think of Big Ten basketball, he's probably the first name that you think of.
Now, on to the show.
Isn't it amazing when Michigan can keep this game to a 19-foot 9-inch game inside that three-point line? It's all theirs. Nice move by Steve Fisher here. Turn it into the 19-9 game.
Ed, thanks for joining us here on the 1909 Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, good. Well, I know you went to Northwestern games as a kid before becoming
Right.
a student at the University of Illinois in the 1970s. So when you dig into kind of your own personal archives about Big Ten basketball from years past, what kind of stands out to you?
Well, I remember one game in particular. I lived about 15 minutes away, and you get to see the Big Ten, kind of in your backyard. In that, Northwestern played back then in McGaw Hall, which was very, I'd say, rickety, very old school gym. And the one game that I remember was that they played number one Michigan, and I think it was 1977 or 78. Michigan came in and they were number one, and the place was filled. Michigan, I think, had Ricky Green, who was their star guard at the time. And Northwestern had Billy McKinney, who was one of their all-time great players, maybe their greatest player that they ever had. And he went on to an NBA career, and I think he was a GM of the Pistons, even Detroit Pistons at one point. And he just had a great game. It was the place was rocking. They took down the number one team in the country. They won that game, and that's one of my more vivid memories of being at a Northwestern game back then.
Gotcha. Northwestern, for those who don't know, redid their stadium a few years back. I think it's a phenomenal look they got
Twice.
going on there.
They actually redid McGaw Hall twice, so that was even predated.
Yeah.
The Welsh Ryan Arena. This was McGaw Hall. It was
A little bit more archaic, no question.
Very right. It was and we were sitting up in the rafters, which weren't very high, but it was but it's still in the rafters. But I remember being at that game, and it was really the place was just rocking. Great game.
And the revision of Welsh Ryan, though, the renovation done there a few years ago, has really created a great environment there for the Wildcats and really a more Big Ten-worthy environment.
Right. They did a great job.
The conference's founding, the Big Ten, it's really rooted in football. And it's had, of course, quite a bit of success on the gridiron. But I want to get a sense from you about, as you kind of did this research into the book, how important has men's basketball been to the conference and its kind of standing in the college sports orbit?
Well, obviously, it's been huge. But just to put it in context, when you think of the popularity of NBA and college basketball, you're not going back as far as football. Basketball obviously existed. The Big Ten played the first 5-on-5 game in 1896, University of Chicago at Iowa. University of Chicago, coached by Amos Alonzo Stagg, and that game was. I went back and looked at the game. Final score 13-12. Big offensive barn burner. So basketball existed, and they had some great names that we'll go over. But the history of college basketball is fairly recent. I mean, even the NCAA basketball tournament didn't start hitting the height of its popularity until the late 70s. Really pretty much the Magic Johnson, Larry Bird game kind of really elevated that the tournament. So you're talking really only 40, 45 years when college basketball became this, huge phenomenon that it is now. Even in the early 80s, they gave the networks gave the early games to ESPN, figuring no one's going to want to watch early, afternoon basketball, and ESPN kind of aired those games and they became wildly popular. And the networks, on second thought, we'll take those games. So, I mean, it wasn't even, I think that they didn't go to 64 teams until the early 80s. So, back when I started watching basketball, I think it was 32 team tournament. I mean, basically you had to win your conference or you weren't in the tournament. And so when you say that, I would think in the last 40, 50 years, obviously basketball has been a huge part of the conference and its exposure and what it's meant to the Big Ten. But again, you're talking about something that's relatively recent compared to football, being the big sport throughout the early 20th century and till today.
And of course, basketball features pretty prominently in your book, This Is Big. And the league's relevance on the hardwood certainly played, as you kind of say, a key part in its rise, especially over, maybe the last 5-6 decades. So who do you see as some of the most influential figures in Big Ten basketball history? If you're creating your Mount Rushmore of Big Ten basketball, who's on that?
Well, I mean, you got to go back to, there was the Big Ten was influential in many ways. If you go way back, I'm not saying this guy necessarily be on the Mount Rushmore, but Wisconsin had a coach called Doc Meanwell in the 1910s, and he went 44-1 in part because he was the first guy to kind of integrate. Hey, let's move guys around. Back then, it was kind of a stationary game, and you look at, and he kind of changed basketball from that way. John Wooden was one of the great coaches of all, obviously maybe the greatest coach of all time, but he was also a great player for the 1932. He's a player of the year for Purdue, great guard, and he was a guy who was, one of the first stars of college basketball for the Big Ten. Big Ten won Big Ten titles, and Indiana won Big Ten titles in the 40s with Branch McCracken. And, so you had guys that, and I think you can't, you have to remember that the great Ohio State teams with Jerry Lucas. I mean, Jerry Lucas probably is definitely on that Mount Rushmore, the Ohio State center. When Ohio State won the national title in 1960, they also had a guy named John Havlicek in the team and a sixth man named Bobby Knight. I mean, it was just an all-time iconic team. But Jerry Lucas was just a transcendent player, and he would have to be on that Mount Rushmore. I mean, you're talking obviously, Bobby Knight was such a pivotal character and figure in the Big Ten. And I think he's one of those guys that when you think of Big Ten basketball, he's probably the first name that you think of. Much like with football, you probably think of Woody Hayes and Bo Schembechler. I mean, Bobby Knight was kind of that figure, winning 3 national titles and being this, winning a ton of Big Ten titles and being, who he was, very controversial, very, and kind of had this, but there's no question about his impact on the Big Ten and what he did for the conference. I think you obviously have to look at Magic Johnson as being one of those stars, Isaiah Thomas as being one of those stars. They've had so many great players, but those guys were like Hall of Fame legendary players. So those are the guys I think of. Tom Izzo in recent years, going to so many Final Fours. It's just a remarkable record of what he's done there. So you're looking at kind of iconic figures of the Big Ten and basketball. You kind of, those guys are pretty good names. Those guys rank in not just in the Big Ten, but, overall nationally basketball.
Absolutely. So much when you go through the process of research and you have this, again, 5-pound book, I mean, it is massive.
Right.
This is big. So as you go about researching this, so much of it's about discovery, right?
Right.
Maybe things you didn't know as much about or didn't know at all, or you discover things had more importance than maybe you thought. So I want to get a sense, as you kind of went through the research for This Is Big, was there something you came across in Big Ten basketball history that was more important or notable than maybe you anticipated, or something you never heard about before that really caught your attention?
Well, there's one, and this is kind of an easy question for me because I was absolutely stunned, because the Big Ten had African-American athletes, dating back to 1900, football, track, obviously Jesse Owens, and there were other track figures. but the Big Ten did not have an African American basketball player until 1948, I believe, 1 year after Jackie Robinson integrated baseball, which to me was hard to believe. I mean, how could they have not had a basketball player African for all that period? There was a player that actually went out for the team at Michigan in the 1930s and was told he was not good enough, and that was kind of a celebrated story. But I was really stunned. Indiana was the first team to integrate the Big Ten, and there were a lot of calls. Well, how come there was a big star in Hammond, Indiana, named Billy Garrett, and right down the road from Bloomington, and there was calls. I mean, there were people saying, "Hey, Big Ten." There was I suppose there was a so-called unwritten rule that they would not recruit African American players for whatever reason, and there was pressure. This newspaper columnist said, "Hey, it's time." It's hypocritical. You have African Americans in other sports, but not basketball. And here's a hometown kid; he should be playing for Indiana. And the university president of Indiana, was a guy named Herman B. Wells, who basically agreed, and he told Rance McCracken, "It's time. We've got to, he should be playing in Indiana." And so to me, I was stunned, surprised, if not stunned, that it took that long for the Big Ten to integrate in basketball.
You wouldn't think that, though. You mentioned Jesse Owens. I mean, he's excelling at Ohio State in the mid 1930s.
Indiana had a black quarterback, in 1945. George, I'm probably Talaferro. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. I mean, there was black stars in other sports, and primarily track and field and football. But I mean, to me, that was just incredible that they did not have a basketball player until that late, until after baseball integrated with Jackie Robinson. It took that long. So that was the biggest eye opener for me.
Absolutely. As you went about this book and you connect with coaches and players, analysts, observers, administrators, and the like, and you're talking about Big Ten basketball, what were some of the common things that came up? What are the words or names you heard most often, or the moments that people just couldn't seem to shake?
I think that that Big Ten, obviously, I think it's kind of a little bit the same as the football, that even though it not really true anymore, but that we kind of play a rugged, kind of a team, in your face kind of basketball, maybe, because
of the reputation. Smash mouth.
Right. But even though that's not really true anymore, when you consider the 3-point game has kind of changed everything in basketball. It's always been it's always physical, but I think it's obviously much more of a guard, long, 3-point oriented game now. Although Illinois, obviously, with Kofi Coburn, has that inside presence. But I think that was kind of the perception, whether or not it's reality. The same way that the Big Ten plays smash mouth football, even though these Ohio State and Michigan games have games where it's 50-45, the final score, where it's wide open games. I would say that that again, you go back to the stars, and I think that the one team that really still stands out is the 1976 Indiana team that went undefeated. That's the last undefeated team. They're going on more than 40. I know this will be 46 years, and how iconic that team was, and how it still kind of stands. There hasn't been another undefeated team in basketball since then. So I think that that's still, we write about that in the book, about how that team really has stood the test of time as probably being the greatest Big Ten basketball team of all time, if not the greatest, one of the greatest teams, probably up there with any of the UCLA teams that went undefeated, one of the all-time teams. And so, you think about those. I think for me, I think that, Isaiah Thomas winning the national title on the same day that President Reagan was shot, almost, assassinated. And that there was a question whether or not that game should even be played. And Wayne Duke, who was the longtime commissioner of the Big Ten, was the head of the NCAA basketball committee for that year. And, how they kind of waited to make sure that the president was going to be okay before deciding to play that game, which was a crazy day in itself, to think that there was actually a basketball game, an NCAA title game played on that day, when obviously we heard later on that, Reagan's injuries were far more severe than they were even, than we knew at the time. And you think about even in recent years, the Big Ten has gone a long time without winning a national title. I think we're going back now to 2000. I think when Michigan State won it. Yet we've had the Big Ten's had a number, including Michigan State, a number of teams play in the Final Four, and go to the final, just haven't been able to get over the hump. And I think that obviously it'd be great to have them finally win a national title, but I think that it doesn't detract from the strength of the conference. If you look at their representation, how they've done in the tournament, they just haven't been able to win the big one the last few years.
Gotcha. Well, with some squads like Purdue and Michigan State this year, hopefully the Big Ten can be on the way to break that streak. I want to get a sense, that the Big Ten tournament is nearing us here. It's upon us. With respect to postseason conference tournaments, the Big Ten was the most notable holdout, really, among the college ranks and the leagues. And the Big Ten's postseason tournament didn't debut until 1998.
Yeah.
So with conferences like the ACC and Big East having such success with their postseason tournaments throughout the 1980s and into the 90s, why was the Big Ten and its leaders just so reluctant to introduce a postseason
I think, again,
tournament?
I think that they're basically a tradition. I think that there was probably 2 points. It feels like it detracts from the regular season. I mean, that the regular season Big Ten champion is not as celebrated now as it used to be, because you have to win you have to win the tournament to kind of complete the daily double. And I think there was also Big Ten presidents have been pretty conservative, very conservative about putting extra demands on the student athletes. And the feeling is that there's already an NCAA tournament that takes, if you go to the Final Four, basically you're taking your players out of school for 3 weeks. Now you're going to add another week with the tournament, a tournament that in some cases, teams play on start playing on Wednesday, and they could go all the way to, Sunday if they advance. And, so now you're losing another week, and you're adding on these extra games, playing 3 games. If you basically the high seeds, number 1 seed still has to win 3 games in 3 consecutive days to win the Big Ten tournament. And so now I think that there was that reluctance to add that extra burden, both from an athletic standpoint, but also an academic standpoint. But there, it just became the point where they couldn't not, they had to do it. I mean, they just were, out there pretty much on an island, and they did it.
As someone who covered the league for so long, do you think that was the right move?
I'm not a great, I think that I'm not a great fan. I love the tournament. Okay, I love the tournament. Obviously, it's great theater, great to watch. I've always questioned this idea of that there's nowhere in the schedule where you ever play 3, even in the NCAA tournament, where you play 3 games in 3 straight days, and more if you're a lower seed and go all the way to the finals. So I question that a little bit. But I question, again, taking them from an academic standpoint, take another week of school gone. I mean, I don't know how these athletes do it during that time, given the stress and the strain and the travel and missing all that school. And I just, so to me, but more so also just the idea of playing 3 or 4 games in a row on consecutive days, which they don't do at any other point during the season. I still question whether or not that's the best thing for these athletes, these players. But everyone does it. It's kind of hard not to do it.
Even if they might have an early season tournament in Maui or something like that,
right? Maybe that's kind of like
there, but it's not the same intensity to the games that you're going to see at the Big Ten.
You haven't played. Right? You're talking maybe there are examples maybe of a Maui, and even that's only a couple of teams. It's not every team in the conference, and you don't play that every year.
Well, and you don't have an 8 seed or a 9 seed fighting for their postseason life, too.
Right. But it's more like these guys have already played 35 games. It's creeping. They're up to like 40 games. Back in the day, you played 25, 28 games the whole season. Now you go to the tournament, you're playing more than 40 games over a limited period of time. And so listen, there's a lot of things in college sports that kind of contradict the mission of academics and going to school. I mean, I think you're just making a lot of demands on these players, and but again, everyone does it, and it's great there to watch it, and I'm sure the players love being a part of it because especially here with the tournament being in Chicago so many years. It's hard to deny it's one of the great events. It's definitely one of the great events in college basketball, especially in Big Ten basketball.
Yeah, and usually the last tournament to wind up to, right before Selection Sunday. And I want to stick on this a little bit, kind of building on what we just talked about and really ask this to close out the show is you're someone who's covered so much college sports in your day, and that really includes not only the games, but also the business of college sports too. And the Big Ten arguably has been one of the most ambitious business players in college sports. And so you've seen the Big Ten evolve and change, and we, of course, have big moments afoot in NCAA athletics with NIL and player movement and really the unrelenting power of football that has really overshadowed college basketball in particular. So where do you see college sports heading? Because when you look in your crystal ball, I imagine it's pretty foggy, but what do you see overall? And specifically, what do you see for the Big Ten in college basketball?
That's a great question. And I think I think they don't even really know the answer. I think we're starting to see some of this stuff play out now with, where guys maybe will stay in school a little bit longer because they can make some money. Maybe, players who are not definitive picks. I think of Kofi at Illinois, who came back, maybe because he saw that he wasn't going to be picked as high, but also he can make a little money. I think it's going to be really interesting to see this whole transfer portal thing and whether or not you start seeing bidding wars for athletes and, that someone comes in, that they can basically move whenever they want. What's to stop a school from swooping in and offering a superstar at Purdue, hey, we can give you this amount of money here, come to our school. I think you're going to start seeing that the transfer issue become more and more of a factor. But, again, I think a lot of these things they end up playing themselves out and they end up working themselves out. I think that there's a lot of always forecasts of doom and gloom and how it's going to change sports. And I think of baseball in particular when, when free agency started in the 70s and, they said, oh, that's going to ruin baseball and that the rich teams are just going to be the ones who get all the players. And they did. But, you've seen non-rich teams be very competitive. It was more than just paying players. I mean, you have to scout. And obviously it made baseball, it used to be drawing 2 million fans was like, oh my God, that was amazing. Now that's like a speed bump and teams are drawing 3, sometimes even 4 million. Popularity of baseball rose. Again, I'm not sure how the basketball thing is gonna work itself out. I think that the one thing to watch really is if you start seeing bidding wars for players, the star players, because again, you're talking about you're still talking about a fraction of players who are going to be able to cash in on their stardom big time. Really the star players, but is the first guy, is the role player, the forward who, starts, but is, basically kind of, averaging 8 points a game.
Scorer or the fourth.
Right. Yeah. Third or fourth. Is he going to be able to cash in? Probably not. I think there's going to be a little bit of a have and have not situation because you're talking about, money and, they're going to give money to the players who are the stars. And so how many stars are there, on a team or even in a conference that are going to be able to get a big money? But, so I think that's going to be something to watch and play out. The transfer thing, to me, is the really intriguing part of the story. And you're starting to see some of it now in football with guys kind of, who aren't either recruits who aren't playing somewhere or guys who are leaving. And now I think you're going to see that happen also in basketball. And, saw that happen in basketball last year with, I'm forgetting, an Illinois player who transferred to LSU, who was one of their star recruits, and, Adam Miller. And, he went to LSU transferring because he didn't, after a year, he didn't. I think there was questions whether how he was being used at Illinois, but he had a chance to transfer. Boom, go down to LSU. I think you're going to be seeing a lot more of that. You're seeing a lot more movement. I see it, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. If it really, we've seen the proliferation of how much coaches make, crazy money. I went back and did I looked back for for something I was doing, and I did a story on athletics and academics. I mean, economics of college sports. I did a series for the Tribune in the early 90s, and it was astounding that Lou Henson in Illinois made $300,000 a year. $300,000, highest paid person in the university. When $300,000 is a lot of money, obviously. But now it's like, these guys are making $5-6 million a year, and that's going to only go up as we've seen what's happening in college football salaries, and the same thing's going to happen in basketball. So will the same thing happen with players? Will these players start be making seven-figure, the stars? It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah. Assistant coaches now making $300,000.
Oh no, assistant coaches are making the top assistants making seven figures for sure.
Yeah,
your number one assistant's probably making seven figures. I mean, it's crazy. How much money that that these coaches make, and I mean, obviously the market kind of demands it. And the other thing that we didn't even touch on: will athletes start getting paid? We talk about but will the schools again, who are paying all these coaches and administrators, athletic directors, seven figures, and yet they say there's no money for the athletes. I mean, will they start, will there be more of a push, obviously, to pay all the athletes? That's something to watch. That's still very much on the table.
As someone who knows and is really kind of, communicated with Big Ten administration as well as the university administration, what do you think is most unsettling for them about this?
I think they're concerned about where the money's going to come from. I think that there's concern, and we already saw it at the beginning of the pandemic, when as soon as it looked like the money was be short, schools started cutting the quote unquote Olympic sports, or the non-revenue sports, the swimming and the wrestling,
gymnastics,
and it's just a weird game that's going on. They don't have money for that, but they have money to build these elaborate. Illinois, I think, raising $40 million again I just saw, and I might be, just correct me if I'm wrong, but to redo their basketball facility. It's this constant. All these football facilities are just like, you build one for $50 million, and in 3 years it's almost out of date because your rival just built one for $100 million. And so there's this arms race. And again, we talked about the coaches making, terrific money. And yet, again, at some point the athletes are saying, and we're getting to that point where, hey, we want to be paid. And we're already seeing it again with name, image, likeness. And I think that there's going to be, again, pressure for some, these athletes, to receive some sort of, payment. And again, how that's going to play out. And there's all sorts of factors about big, schools being, these athletic departments being nonprofit, and, athletic, workman's compensation, and all sorts of issues. It's going to be an issue. It's going to be an interesting road the next, 10, 12 years to see how it plays out.
Yeah, well, this is certainly not the Big Ten you started covering, and NCAA athletics you started covering early on in your career.
Well, actually, it's interesting because, I start the book talking about the origins of the Big Ten in 1896 and how the conference came about. And the conference came about basically, it's the first big conference in college sports. And basically, it was the presidents trying to get together to try to rope in this new idea of college sports, that athletes representing your school would be playing other schools, and it was very much of a Wild West mentality of paying athletes, and athletes not going to school, and maybe athletes playing for two different schools, or maybe athletes playing for 8 years from one school. There were no rules, and so they tried to put these rules into effect to try to give some order to college sports. And I kind of think, it's a precursor to still what we're seeing over 120 years later. They're still trying to get their arms around it, as far as with academics and with economics and rules and things like that, because it's basically foreshadowed what's gone on for all the 20th century and now into the 21st century. So this really, a lot of this stuff dates back to 1896, and how these issues still need to be resolved, and they have a lot of challenges involved in trying to resolve them.
And I think we have all this swirling around us, as you kind of eloquently point out. From some of it a century old, and it's
right.
Still these whirlwinds swirl. And I think what we celebrate here at 99 is really the game between the lines, and the stories and the personalities and excitement of that energy that happens on the court. And so, Ed, we appreciate you joining us here on the 99 podcast and sharing some rich insight and perspectives on the Big Ten Conference and its history.
Thank you for listening to the 99 podcast. If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, make sure you do. And while you're at it, leave us a rating or review. 5 stars only, like the basketball camp. We also have links to all of 99 social media so you never miss a release. Until next time.